40%. That is how much of Russia's Baltic sea oil export capacity vanished in only 120 hours. Hundreds of drones were intercepted. Dozens of S-400 and Pantsir S-1 systems stayed on round-the-clock combat duty. A thick wall of anti-aircraft fire wrapped around the Leningrad region, a zone the Kremlin once considered untouchable. And the outcome? The port still burned. The supposedly secure Baltic corridor turned into a dead zone. Russia's war machine is now bleeding roughly $300 million a day because the export nozzles have been clamped shut. Why did this happen? Because Ukraine cracked one of the most important codes of modern warfare with a brutally effective asymmetric formula. This was not the triumph of one miracle weapon. It was the fusion of cheap airborne platforms, razor-sharp intelligence, and total control of the night. Ukraine exploited the deadly weaknesses of a heavy, rigid defense architecture, proving that speed, adaptability, and imagination could outperform every conventional military expectation. But the highest level of this formula was geopolitical awareness. Kyiv turned Washington's own efforts to stabilize global energy markets into a ready-made target map, striking directly at the Kremlin's financial bloodstream. Everything began at 23 o'clock on March 25, 2026. The freezing night over the Baltic Sea north of St. Petersburg was suddenly ripped open by a blazing burst of fire at Vyborg port, where a military icebreaker, the heavy enforcer responsible for keeping critical Arctic logistics lanes open, was unexpectedly reduced to a mass of twisted scrap, rolling hard to port before slowly slipping beneath the freezing water. After crossing more than 600 miles, the equivalent of launching an aircraft from Washington, D.C., and landing it inside a garage in Chicago, Ukraine delivered a spectacular opening move, striking directly at the Kremlin's most overconfident logistics branch while it was still dreaming of absolute safety. That first blow was not just the destruction of a costly ship weighing thousands of tons, it was a deeply treacherous tactical and psychological hit designed to erase the very idea of a sanctuary from the minds of Moscow's generals, forcing them into a panicked scramble to redirect early warning systems northward and backward. And that panic triggered an enormously expensive chain reaction, because while Russia's military giant was busy swiveling billion-dollar surveillance eyes toward distant maritime threats, it unknowingly opened fatal gaps just a few dozen feet above the ground. That was the exact setup Ukraine needed to prepare something even more devastating for the following night at Kirishi. By taking out the Pathfinder target in Vyborg, Ukraine indirectly fed the Russians a false narrative. It pushed them to believe the main threat axis would be aimed at surface naval assets. That illusion created the perfect defensive vacuum for low-flying drone ghosts to slip in quietly and slash the throat of the war machine at the refinery on the next night. Then came 22 o'clock on March 26, 2026. While generals in Moscow were still shouting beside the wet, ruined remains lying near the bottom of the Vyborg harbor, a massive black column of smoke suddenly punched upward to nearly 70,000 feet above the Kyiv oil refinery in Kirishi, brushing the edge of the stratosphere, a realm more associated with U-2 reconnaissance aircraft than refinery fires. On that second night, Ukraine scored a crushing victory through a polished blend of hacking capability and highly deceptive force placement. Instead of throwing blind strikes at random blocks of concrete, Kyiv used intelligence down to the foot, reportedly supported by Western infrared satellite data, to identify exactly which storage tanks were packed with fuel and which ones were empty. It was like a gourmet knowing exactly which candy had caramel inside without opening the wrapper. That success was also built on the legacy of the first night in Vyborg. The strike on the icebreaker generated a kind of signal smokescreen, keeping Russian radars focused on scanning the northern sea surface. That gave low-flying drones a cleaner corridor to sneak through the defensive seams and approach Kirishi with minimal resistance, turning millions of gallons of jet fuel and diesel into ash at one of Russia's largest oil refineries was not merely another explosion. It was a surgical strike against the enemy's mobility, because tanks and bombers, no matter how aggressive they look, are nothing more than dead iron if the fuel source disappears. The hit on Kirishi shoved the Kremlin into an absurd dilemma. It had to choose between redeploying scarce air defense assets to shield the military's lifeblood, or continuing to protect the export ports that guarded the nation's cash flow. That hesitation, the natural delay of a bloated system, opened the door for the next stage. As Russia rushed Pantsir S-1 units to shield domestic refineries, it unknowingly exposed another fatal vulnerability. Ukraine understood that after a painful strike to the stomach, the enemy's instinct would be to curl inward and protect its vital organs. And that was Kyiv's golden moment. It used that predictable reflex to prepare the decisive hit on the biggest foreign currency pumping nozzle in the Baltic region, where aging oil depots were left exposed like candles waiting for a match. Then came 21 o'clock on March 27, 2026. The night sky above the Gulf of Finland split open as Ukraine launched an all-in attack on Luga, a site treated by Russia's financial establishment as the crown jewel of Baltic oil exports. There, giant oil depots with capacities of millions of gallons were laid out almost helplessly before the attacker, like a flock of fat ducks in an open field. It was all the product of a Soviet-era design philosophy built to survive NATO bombers and cruise missiles, but never tiny gasoline-engine drones costing a fraction of traditional weapons. Ukraine succeeded at Ust-Luga not only because of daring, but because it ruthlessly exploited a weakness called historical complacency. Russian military planners had long believed that a distance of more than 600 miles was a natural shield against everything except nuclear war. The fuel tanks were positioned so closely together, like dominoes, that even a relatively small drone strike could trigger a terrifying chain of thermal resonance, where one fire fed the next, and firefighting systems became useless before they could catch up. Why did Kyiv choose Luga on the third night and not sooner? Because it was a masterstroke of sequencing. After shaking Vyborg and torching Kirishi, Ukraine forced Russian air defense commanders into a state of near-total paranoia. They no longer knew where to place the S-400 and Pantsir S-1 systems to satisfy the Kremlin's demands, and once the giant fire pillars at Luga climbed thousands of feet into the sky, Russia made one of the most expensive logistics decisions in its recent history. It had to pull elite anti-aircraft assets from surrounding areas and rush them toward the burning oil port to save the wallet. But in reality, Russia concentrating so many expensive systems around Luga was exactly the response Ukraine wanted. Because the moment you pile all your most valuable toys into one location, you turn them into perfect prey for a financial war of exhaustion. Then came the next night. At 22 o'clock on March 28, 2026, the skies over the Leningrad region were no longer dominated by towering red infernos from oil depots. Instead, a cheaper but far more unsettling sound took over. The sharp, persistent buzzing of 36 drones infiltrating at once to create one of the harshest mathematical paradoxes in the history of air defense. Russia could boast on Telegram that every target had been shot down, that not one slipped through, but the real damage that night had nothing to do with wreckage on the ground. Kyiv had just gutted the defense budget in a way that few economists in Moscow would dare calculate openly, because Russia's real losses came not from what exploded, but from what it was forced to spend. On one side were drones under £330, worth roughly $50,000 each. On the other side stood S-400 and Pantsir S-1 systems firing interceptor missiles priced from $150,000 to as high as $2 million apiece. Under normal doctrine, to guarantee a kill on a hovering target moving at around 90 miles per hour, Russian crews often need to fire at least 2 missiles per drone. That means bringing down 36 Ukrainian drones could require a minimum of 72 missiles in just a few hours. It was a literal rain of money falling over the Gulf of Finland. Every launch meant trading away the value of a luxury apartment or a high-end supercar, just to kill a flying machine powered by something not much more sophisticated than a household lawnmower engine. And the worst hardware damage did not stop at the missiles. It also came from draining the launch tubes of S-400 battalions and overworking reconnaissance radars, such as the 96 L6E, systems that were never built to sustain non-stop, high-intensity combat against small, isolated targets skimming close to the ground below 100 feet. A typical S-400 launcher carries only 4 missiles. That means one seemingly minor drone raid was enough to push an entire strategic air defense cluster into a temporary empty magazine state, forcing crews into frantic nighttime reload operations, an extremely slow and vulnerable process involving the movement of massive steel missiles weighing thousands of pounds. The depletion of short-range interceptor reserves did not just create a financial deficit worth hundreds of millions of dollars. It also produced a dangerous logistical silence for the next night, when launchers were still waiting to be rearmed and radar crews were collapsing from exhaustion after hours of scanning jammed screens for tiny low-level threats. That fourth night was the knife slicing through the final rope holding Russia's defensive anchor in place, and it cleared the way for the finishing blow on the fifth night, when the Leningrad fortress was finally drained of both material strength and fighting spirit. So, what is the lesson? If you use $1 million diamond-studded scepter to crush a 50-cent fly, you may feel proud that the fly is dead, but you should also turn around and look at what remains of your scepter. Then came 4 o'clock on March 29, 2026, that dead zone of human alertness when the brain turns to mashed potatoes, and even the toughest Russian radar crews were fighting sleep beside cold cups of coffee after an entire night battling Ukraine's 36 buzzing decoys and raiders. That was when the SBU delivered the final stab, returning to Luga for the second time in only 3 days. This time, Kyiv did not need a giant strike package. It sent only a handful of quiet assassins gliding at about 100 feet above sea level, using the calm waters of the Gulf of Finland like a mirror, masking themselves against rocky coastlines and fjord-like terrain, while Russian warning systems choked on sea clutter. When those drones reached the target, they ignored the giant crude tanks already blackened by previous fires. Instead, they went straight for the pumping cranes and the fractional distillation tower system, the sophisticated mechanisms that served as the operational heart of the entire oil port. The lawnmower engine buzz was heard for only a few seconds before a violent chain of secondary explosions ripped across the dawn sky, hurling steel sections weighing thousands of pounds into the air like flaming shrapnel. Witnesses in the distance described the ground shaking as if an earthquake had passed through. Sickly blue flames from gas and refined oil surged more than 500 feet into the air, exposing the helpless state of S-400 launchers sitting silent, either empty of missiles or unable to lock onto targets flying lower than a masthead. The collapse of Luga on that fifth night was the soaring climax of a carefully orchestrated symphony of destruction. Each detonation did more than incinerate millions of gallons of oil. It also burned away the Kremlin's last confidence in its ability to shield the financial arteries that kept the system alive. Ukraine prevailed through a brilliantly executed logistical jailbreak. It used the fourth night to drain the enemy's last interceptor reserves. Then, on the fifth night, it walked into the oil port almost as if it were open ground, and lit massive torches that exposed the tactical bankruptcy of a clumsy empire. The answer also lies in the fatal blind spot of the 96 L6E radar systems. Moscow had always celebrated. These were machines built to search the upper sky for glossy NATO aircraft and cruise missiles. They were never prepared for lawnmower-like drones skimming wave tops at barely 90 miles per hour. At that painfully low altitude, Russian radar filtering algorithms were overwhelmed by sea clutter. A drone carrying hundreds of pounds of explosives could appear no more remarkable than a seagull hunting for food on the screen. Striking the same strategic target twice in the same week was not just another explosion. It was a steel-hard declaration that Russia's Baltic defense network had officially collapsed like a sandcastle in front of the tide. Ukraine won because it understood a brutal truth of modern warfare. You can build an impregnable fortress with billion-dollar steel walls, but it will still fall if your enemy finds a dark parking garage entrance you forgot to lock or were too careless to secure. This strike is proof that the Leningrad anti-air umbrella has become little more than a leaking basket, where expensive S-400 missiles have turned into luxury paperweights after being drained in earlier nights. Ukraine composed a deeply mischievous symphony of destruction, and every night was another chess move tightening the trap. If night 1 in Vyborg was the opening slap that made Moscow panic and stare toward the Arctic, then night 2 in Kirishi was the blade thrust into the military stomach, where millions of gallons of jet fuel went up in flames and forced the Kremlin to choose between feeding the front line and securing the interior. That inferno at Kirishi then opened the path for night 3 in Luga, where Ukraine began hollowing out the empire's wallet by exploiting the negligence of Soviet-era open-air depots that had no meaningful anti-drone shielding at all. That treacherous strike forced Russia to gather its most expensive toys, the S-400s, and their supporting systems, around the oil port, unintentionally setting them up for the exhausting missile burn operation of night 4, when 36 cheap drones drained their readiness, and then finally, when the radar crews were seeing stars and the launch tubes of million-dollar missile systems had become empty steel shells, night 5 arrived as the finishing stab into a target that had completely lost the ability to defend itself. And the peak irony of this whole symphony of destruction was not the fire pillars at Luga. It was the scene inside climate-controlled offices in Washington, D.C., where U.S. Treasury officials were trying to cool gasoline prices for voters by easing restrictions on some Russian oil shipments, unintentionally transforming dry economic statements into a near-perfect target list for Ukrainian drone planners. The moment Washington signaled that certain energy infrastructures mattered for keeping global oil prices stable, Ukraine understood that those exact points were the most fatal nodes to strike if the goal was to cut off the Kremlin's most valuable stream of foreign currency. In effect, America's effort to calm the market became a guiding arrow for drones flying 600 miles into Russian air defense territory. And now, with 40% of Baltic export capacity gone up in black smoke in only 120 hours, Russia looks like a wealthy man standing at a banquet table while a giant hole is ripped through the middle of his wallet. The Black Sea is no longer secure. The Baltic is now burning as a reminder that the prestige of an energy superpower can collapse before cheap but intelligent systems. Bye for now.